Hello, and welcome once more to another episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Once more with your favorite host, the one and only Cave Cat. For today's episode, not only do we get to venture back into the world of Hanna-Barbera once again, but it's time for us to go back in time again. This time back to 1977, when NBC was just releasing their Saturday morning schedule for the season. In fact, the last time that I talked about NBC Saturday morning cartoons was when I reviewed Space Cats 2 episodes ago, talking about how it was released around the time that NBC Saturday morning cartoons were starting to go under. But on to the subject for today's episode. Today, I'm going to be talking about CB Bears. For those who don't know, CB Bears was actually an anthology series comprised of 6 different segments, each segment parodying a different form of pop culture or even different celebrities. Of course, parodying pop culture is nothing new for Hanna-Barbera, nor is parodying specific celebrities of the time, especially since quite a lot of cartoon characters, whether they're from Disney, Warner Brothers, or even Hanna-Barbera, actually came about as a result of being parodies of well-known or even obscure celebrities that were rather popular at the time. But since this is an anthology series, as I mentioned before, this show ended up running for an hour during its first run when it first premiered on NBC, until a year later when it got split up into 2 different shows, with one half-hour airing 3 segments and the other half-hour airing the other 3 segments. Also, much like a lot of Hanna-Barbera's other input of the 1970s, this show only lasted for 1 season. I actually talked about this in my video talking about why I think that Jetsons the movie is an underrated masterpiece, being that Hanna-Barbera made quite a lot of shows that weren't as popular as the likes of Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound, the Flintstones, the Jetsons, or even Scooby-Doo, especially with all the Scooby-Doo clones that have been released during the 1970s. Also, the idea of Hanna-Barbera creating an animated anthology series would actually pave the way for other such series as Animaniacs, or even Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon Show or Nickelodeon's Oh Yeah cartoons. I mean, talk about innovative. But anyway, in order to review CB Bears as a whole, I'm going to talk about each and every segment individually, because as I mentioned before, there's 6 segments altogether that make up the entire show, and all of them have varying levels of quality. Now that that's over, let's get started. First off, we have the CB Bears themselves, which is a parody of Charlie's Angels. It's about a trio of anthropomorphic bears named Hustle, Boogie, and Bump who work as undercover detectives under the guise of being garbage collectors, right down to even driving a garbage truck that they refer to as the perfume wagon. In each episode, the trio receive a message from their female superior named Charlie, who briefs them on a different mission involving a lot of strange goings-on, ranging from a mansion mysteriously vanishing into thin air, the citizens of a mining town turning green for no reason, mountains disappearing into the ground, and other strange phenomena. For the 3 main bears themselves, we have Hustle, who serves as the leader of the trio, Boogie, who is the most excitable, as well as having a habit of being turned on by the sound of Charlie's voice, and Bump, who is the more cowardly of the trio, prone to running away when things get a little too hairy. Not only does this segment parody Charlie's Angels, but it also has some very strong Scooby-Doo vibes to it as well, being that the bears find themselves in a lot of comical and occasionally scary situations while trying to solve the mystery. From what I heard, Hustle, Bump, and Boogie are said to be based off of Hair Bear, Square Bear, and Booby Bear from Hanna-Barbera's own Help, It's the Hair Bear bunch, even right down to Hustle being voiced by Dawes Butler with the exact same Phil Silvers-esque voice that was also used for Hair Bear and especially Hokey Wolf. In fact, their personalities are even quite similar to those of the Hair Bear bunch, albeit to a slight degree. Not only was the segment a parody of Charlie's Angels with a little bit of Scooby-Doo thrown in, but it was also meant to be a parody of the Citizens Band radio craze that had begun slowly dying down near the end of the 1970s, with the bears themselves meant to act like stereotypical truckers as part of their detective cover. Then again, there have been several trucker films that have been released around the time of the show, such as Smokey and the Bandit starring Burt Reynolds, and even Every Which Way But Loose starring Clint Eastwood. But with the decline in Citizens Band radio, it's no wonder that this particular segment was a product of its time. Despite this, however, it's fun to see what crazy situations Hustle, Bump, and Boogie get into while trying to solve the mystery. Also, surprisingly enough, there was actually an episode that parodied the original Star Wars, which was released the same year as that of this show, complete with the villain of that episode being accompanied by a robot that looked a little like R2-D2. Then again, it's not too surprising since that episode was released as a part of the Star Wars craze at the time, before Hanna-Barbera would also release Yogi's Space Race a year later to also ride on the coattails of Star Wars as well. But I digress. Even though the concept of a trio of bears going on all sorts of adventures is nothing new for Hanna-Barbera, after the release of Help, It's the Hair Bear Bunch 6 years prior to the show, it's still interesting to see that they decided to put a spin on the general concept and have the bears act as undercover detectives passing themselves off as garbage collectors. And also, here's a little bit of a fun fact for you. When the series was in production, for the segment, they were originally going to show Charlie's face whenever she would brief the bears on their missions, before the producers decided that it would be best if they don't show her at all, akin to that of the actual Charlie of Charlie's Angels. And it's not just this particular segment that had to have a few things changed around while it was in production, but some of the other segments also had to be changed as well to fit the demographic, but I'll get to them once I cover the other segments. But on the whole, I think the way that this particular segment came together really makes it amusing and entertaining for being a Charlie's Angels parody. And yeah, like I said, parodying pop culture and various celebrities is nothing new for Hanna-Barbera, and things are only going to get even more interesting once I cover the other remaining 5 segments for the show. Again, the CB Bear segments of the CB Bear Show are fun and amusing, with the characters of Hustle, Bump, and Boogie getting thrown into different mysteries and situations, even in spite of the Dying Citizen Band's radio craze. But with that, combined with the mystery-solving formula and the regular Hanna-Barbera comedy and action style, I think it's safe to say that CB Bears really does deserve to have top billing in the show. Next is Blast Off Buzzard, which is about a buzzard named, well, Blast Off Buzzard, who is constantly trying to catch a snake named Crazy Legs but can never succeed at doing so. Much like how the CB Bear segments are a parody of Charlie's Angels, these segments are actually a parody of the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons. And also like the Roadrunner cartoons, these segments have no dialogue, save for Blast Off Buzzard doing some vocalizations, such as snickering, gasping, or even screaming. There's also another fun fact regarding this segment as well. Originally, Joseph Barbera pitched this segment as having Blast Off Buzzard chasing after a rabbit, but it was rejected by NBC at first, presumably because they thought the idea of a buzzard chasing a rabbit was just too cruel by television standards, even though there were several Bugs Bunny cartoons where he was also targeted by Beaky Buzzard or even Wile E. Coyote. I mean, talk about a double standard. But anyway, story artist Jerry Eisenberg suggested that they instead change the rabbit to a snake, and once that happened, this time the Blast Off Buzzard segments were approved. Each episode involves Blast Off Buzzard coming up with rather elaborate yet convoluted plans to try and catch Crazy Legs, similar to how Wile E. Coyote would also come up with various plans to catch the Roadrunner via the use of various inventions from Acme that would always end up backfiring on him. I thought that this segment was okay. There's nothing really all that special about it, just a buzzard chasing after a snake in an attempt to copy the Roadrunner cartoons. Some parts of it are amusing, but nothing really stood out for me about these shorts. And even though Blast Off Buzzard and Crazy Legs were later added in Tom and Jerry Kids later on, not to mention being able to talk compared to how they were silent here, only 2 cartoons of this reimagining had been made for that series. In a way, it's a little bit similar to how in Animaniacs, one of the recurring characters of the series was Minerva Mink, yet only 2 cartoons featuring her were made. But in that case, the reason why Minerva never had any more cartoons after that was because there was an outcry over how her character was way too over-sexualized for parents' tastes. But back to Blast Off Buzzard, I think that it felt way too much like the Roadrunner cartoons in hindsight. Yes, each segment of the show is meant to parody a different form of pop culture, as I mentioned before, but the reason I say that's too much like the Roadrunner cartoons is because of the complete lack of dialogue in the shorts. I mean, they could have at least given voices to both Blast Off Buzzard and Crazy Legs in order for the audience to hear their thoughts on what's going on and to really relate to what the characters are going through in each and every single chase. Almost like the titular characters of the Patty Frailings, the Ant, and the Aardvark. And that particular short series was also similar to the Roadrunner cartoons, but at least the writers and producers actually gave voices to both the Ant and the Aardvark so that we, the audience, could really hear them voice their own opinions on the different situations that they get into. Whereas with the Blast Off Buzzard segments, the decision to have them silent in the original show just made it feel too much like a carbon copy of the Roadrunner cartoons. I mean, it's one thing to parody a certain form of pop culture and to actually do it in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, but to completely copy the thing you're parodying while making it feel too much like what you're parodying will only result in the product ending up becoming nothing more than a dud. And that's exactly what's happened to Blast Off Buzzard here. Being that it tried too hard to be just like the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons, that it ended up being too much like those cartoons. At least the previous segment and the other ones following this one actually put some interesting spins on what they were parroting, but this particular segment just tried too hard to be too much like what it was parroting, and that ended up hurting it during its run. I apologize for the redundant statement, but it's the truth. I think it's really sad the way the Blast Off Buzzard segments turned out. Had it actually put a more interesting spin on parroting the Roadrunner cartoons, it probably would have caught my attention and would have kept audiences enraptured. But because it was too copy-paste of the Roadrunner cartoons, it's by far the weakest of the segments of the CB Bear show. Now, hey, it's the king! I'm not kidding, that's actually the title of this next segment. And as for what this one is about, it's about a lion named King, along with his friends, a hippopotamus named Big H, a gorilla named Clyde, an alligator named Skids, a hyena named Yucca Yucca, a lioness named Sheena, and an ostrich named Zelda, who attend high school and often come up with all sorts of zany schemes in order to get attention from those around them. As for this particular segment, it's actually a parody of Happy Days, albeit an all-animal version of Happy Days, right down to King even resembling and acting like Fonzie. However, unlike Fonzie, King has a tendency to act rather irrationally and impulsively when it comes to coming up with various schemes. But despite this, when things get rather hairy, King will oftentimes come up with plans to get himself and his friends out of a jam. This segment is actually a bit of a step up compared to that of Blast Off Buzzard, because even if the segment is a parody of Happy Days, at least it actually put an interesting spin on Happy Days, with the characters being depicted as various jungle animals. Much like the previous two segments, here's another fun fact. When the segment was in production, King and his friends were originally going to be placed in the jungle, much like regular jungle animals, with the only known form of civilization being a malt shop where the animals would hang out, along with the fact that Clyde was originally named Square. Instead, the producers decided to have King and his friends in the big city, as well as changing Clyde's name to what it is now. Moving on, each segment features King and his friends taking part in an activity of some kind and thinking of how they can accomplish an even bigger feat. Whether it's recruiting a rare kangaroo to take part in the long jump, going to Mars, taking part in a car race, competing in a surfing competition, among others. In a way, the many different antics and situations that King and his friends get into when attempting to pull off their schemes feel like what Hokey Wolf or even Top Cat would go through whenever they would try some sort of crazy get-rich-quick schemes. In a way, I feel like it's also what inspired a similar gulf with the title or characters of Cartoon Network's Ed and Nettie, where they try to scam the other kids at the cul-de-sac out of their money for job breakers, often to no success, but that's probably just me. Anyway, I feel that the Hey, It's the King segments are actually on the same level of quality as that of the CB Bear segments, since much like the latter putting an interesting spin on Charlie's Angels, they do a pretty good job of putting an interesting spin on Happy Days, compared to when Blast Off Buzzard tried to parody the Roadrunner cartoons, but just felt too much like the Roadrunner cartoons when doing so. The characters of this segment are also charming and likable in their own ways, with King being the leader with the big ideas, Big H being the stereotypical foodie obsessed with food, Clyde being the gentle big guy while also bearing a bit of a resemblance to that of Moose from the Archie comics, Skids being the mechanical whiz, albeit his prowess somewhat leaves something to be desired, Yucca Yucca being the jokester and funny guy, which is appropriate for a hyena, and lastly, Sheena and Zelda being stereotypical cheerleaders who always come up with random cheers for King, which always confuses King and the others. I really like the idea of jungle animals in an urban setting pulling off all kinds of various schemes while still keeping the spirit of the pop culture that it's parroting. Almost like a precursor to Disney's Tailspin, but slightly different. I say this because while the main characters of the segment are anthropomorphic jungle animals, the city isn't exclusively inhabited by animals. There's also humans in the city as well that King and his friends meet with. So it's basically what TV tropes refers to as lions, tigers, and humans, oh my, where a different work features both humans and anthropomorphic animals in the same setting. Despite this, I still enjoyed the Hey, It's the King segments because, like the CB Bear segments, they actually did a good job putting an interesting spin on the pop culture that they're parroting, as I mentioned before. And here's hoping that the next segments following the previous three are actually just as good. Next up, Posse Impossible. This is actually an interesting one, because not only is this segment a parody of westerns in general, but it actually features a parody of famous western giant John Wayne regarding one of the characters. So to start off this segment, it's about a sheriff and his rather somewhat inept posse of cowboys living in the Wild West town of Saddle Sore, where they make it their job to catch any no-good varmints that come to their town to cause trouble, like pull off bank robberies or robbing stagecoaches. And despite their constantly bumbling about, the sheriff and his posse somehow always manage to catch the various criminals that come to town and bring them to justice. Also, believe it or not, Posse Impossible themselves actually made their very first appearance in the final episode of Hong Kong Phooey, where they were among the various characters that were called in to help clear Hong Kong Phooey's name of a crime that he didn't commit. After that, Posse Impossible ended up being included in their own series of segments as part of the CB Bear Show, and it really fits with the rest of the demographic of the show. For the characters, we have the Sheriff of Saddlesore, who, despite being exasperated by the ineptitude of his posse, still fearlessly leads them into the line of duty. Big Duke, who is the most eager to rush into the line of duty despite being the shortest. Stick, who is the more dim-witted of the group. And Blubber, who, as his name implies, has a tendency to blubber like a baby when the situation is too much for him to handle, yet he still does his part to help the others bring justice to the criminals. Also, remember how I said that this segment features a John Wayne parody? Well, that's because Big Duke himself was voiced by Dawes Butler, who actually managed to pull off a rather impressive imitation of John Wayne. Then again, it's no surprise that Big Duke got his name from John Wayne's nickname, the Duke. But anyway, in each episode, we've seen the sheriff and his posse go after various criminals, ranging from payroll thieves, cattle rustlers, a snake oil salesman, a circus sideshow, and many others. Much like the rest of the segments of the show, save for Blast Off Buzzard, of course, Posse Impossible really fits in with the pop culture parody motif of the CB Bear Show, being that's a parody of various westerns, with the likes of the Gene Autry Show, Gunsmoke, The Wild Wild West, or even Have Gun Will Travel, among others. Despite the fact that the sheriff and his posse will invariably screw things up while trying to do their job in catching criminals, it's always fun to see what crazy antics and situations that the heroes get themselves into before they finally manage to find a way to prevail over the criminals that they've been chasing after. Also, I'm a fan of westerns in general, so it was natural that I would also find myself enjoying this segment as well. I apologize if this review was shorter than the other reviews about the other segments, since I can't really think of anything else to say about Posse Impossible. All I can say is that Posse Impossible really does deserve to be a part of the CB Bear Show, much like with Hey, It's the King, since like with those other segments, it really does put a great spin on parodying westerns, and especially John Wayne in particular. And I believe that the other two segments following this one also fit well with the parody motif of this anthology series. So anyway, as Big Duke himself would say, let's move 'em out! Up next on the roster, we have Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Oh boy, is this one going to be the most interesting to cover out of all the other segments. It's about three ghosts named, well, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, who run the Haunted Inn, which is basically a hotel for ghosts, ghouls, and monsters, as the trio try to cater to the needs of their guests. Now, I bet that a lot of you are probably wondering, wait a minute, I thought you said that all of the segments of the show are parodies of pop culture. What is this one supposed to parody? Well, with the three titular ghosts, not only are their names taken from the 1950s rock and roll song of the same name, but sources say that they're also supposed to be parodies of old-time comedians Hugh Herbert, Lou Costello, and Marty Allen, respectively. Don't know who those guys are? Look them up. But anyway, like I said before, parodying pop culture and celebrities of the time is nothing new for Hanna-Barbera. But let's not beat around the bush and let's just get around to talking about this particular segment. In each episode, we're treated to shake, rattle, and roll working hard and running the Haunted Inn, not just intending to whatever ghosts or monsters intend the hotel, but some episodes also have them having to deal with the notorious ghost hunter Sidney Merciless, whose goal is to try and catch the ghosts and monsters residing at the Haunted Inn, but they always outsmart him at every turn. Some episodes also have Shake, Rattle, and Roll having to deal with the pesky ghost mouse that's always stealing food in the kitchen of the hotel, to which their faithful poltercat always tries to catch the ghost mouse, often to no success. With this segment, the three main characters are also goofy and quirky, while also fitting the comic trio paradigm as well. Shake is the more cowardly and pusillanimous of the trio, Rattle is the de facto leader of the trio who's always barking out orders to his two companions, and Roll is the more easygoing ghost who serves as the chef of the hotel. This is another segment that I also enjoy quite a lot, because it's always fun to see what shenanigans that the three ghosts get up to while running their hotel. And it's not just Sidney Merciless or even the Ghost Mouse that the trio have to deal with, no. Some episodes also have Shake, Rattle, and Roll having to deal with a ghost or a monster who turns out to be an annoying guest through different circumstances, which I'm sure that a lot of hotel proprietors can relate to in regards to having to deal with rude or annoying guests. In all of these episodes, it's always fun to see what crazy situations or antics that Shake, Rattle, and Roll get themselves into while they run the haunted inn. And it's also fun to see their personalities reflect the comedians that they're parroting, which really allows them to play off of each other. The concept of a trio of ghosts running a hotel is very amusing and unique, even if some parts of it feel like that's copying Casper the Friendly Ghost a bit too much. But hey, at least this segment is still putting an interesting spin on what it's parroting, unlike the Blast Off Buzzard cartoons, which were nothing more than a blatant carbon copy of the Roadrunner cartoons. In a way, I would say that this segment is on the same level of quality as that of the CB Bear segments and the Hey, It's the King segments. Despite the fact that Shake, Rattle, and Roll isn't actually parroting a show or movie like the other segments, parroting comedians from long ago actually counts as parroting pop culture, no matter how old it is. So I feel that's a good reason why Shake, Rattle, and Roll also fits with the motif of parroting pop culture like the other segments. Again, the concept of a trio of ghosts acting as proprietors of a hotel for ghosts, ghouls, and monsters is just so inventive and amusing, though I can't help but wonder if this particular segment might have possibly inspired the Hotel Transylvania films. You know, with both the segment and those films focusing on a hotel for different kinds of ghosts and monsters, while also having to deal with intruders from the outside world. Then again, it's probably just me. But on the whole, the Shake, Rattle, and Roll segments definitely deserve to be part of the CB Bear show. Simple as that. Last but not least, Undercover Elephant. This is the last segment of the CB Bear show that I'll be reviewing. For this segment, it's about an elephant named, well, Undercover Elephant, who works for an organization called Central Control while accompanied by his mouse sidekick, Loudmouse. To round off the parody motif of this anthology series, this segment actually parodies Mission Impossible, being that each episode begins with Undercover Elephant and Loudmouse receiving a message from the chief to brief them on various missions involving various criminals who are about to commit different crimes. And also like Mission Impossible, the messages that Undercover Elephant receives end up exploding once he's been briefed on the mission. And once that happens, Undercover Elephant and Loudmouse set out to catch the criminals before they can actually pull off their crimes. Of course, despite the fact that Undercover Elephant works as a detective, the hardest part of his job is that he has to try and go undercover to try and catch the criminal in the act. A lot of times, this involves him having to wear various disguises, which is rather hilarious considering the fact that as an elephant, it's very hard for him to try and conceal his identity, which of course ends up getting exposed thanks to Loudmouse constantly blowing his cover during each and every stakeout. Another factor that leads to Undercover Elephant's cover getting blown while trying to catch the criminal is the fact that coming into contact with peanuts will cause him to be unable to resist the temptation of having peanuts. And much like with Posse Impossible, Undercover Elephant and Loudmouse always manage to capture the criminals in the end, even in spite of the fact that Undercover Elephant constantly bumbles around on the mission. This is another segment that I thought was okay. It's not as bad as Blast Off Buzzard, but it's still a little bit weaker than the other segments that I've reviewed by far. Despite this, at least it still put an interesting spin on parodying Mission Impossible, what with the exploding messages, the hero having to disguise himself while undercover, and using various gadgets to try and catch the criminals. Even though the segment isn't quite as good as the other segments, I really do like the dynamic that Undercover Elephant and Loudmouse have with each other, really playing off of the relationship of elephants and mice. And even if Loudmouse constantly hinders Undercover's attempts to be inconspicuous, at least he still does his part to help Undercover catch the criminals in the act. To see a parody of Mission Impossible with an elephant and a mouse does actually make this particular segment a bit more interesting compared to Blast Off Buzzard falling short of putting an interesting spin on what it was parodying, as I keep mentioning before. Again, I apologize if this review is a little bit short, but there's not really much else to talk about regarding Undercover Elephant. But I will say this, even if it's a little bit weaker than the other segments, at least it's not as bad as Blast Off Buzzard, because again, at least it put an interesting spin on the pop culture that it was parodying, just like the other segments of the show. And that was all the segments of the CB Bear Show. All in all, it's a pretty good show, even if it was released during a time when a lot of Hanna-Barbera shows didn't quite leave as good an impression on audiences. But then again, it is hard when you're trying to match up to the popularity of Yogi Bear or Scooby-Doo during the 1970s. And admittedly, CB Bears was one of those shows that wasn't able to last beyond one season. And in all honesty, it might be one of Hanna-Barbera's more obscure shows. But if people can learn to look past the obscurity of certain shows, then they might develop a following to said show. That has actually happened before, being that some shows that turn out did not do so well on television do end up gaining a cult following even long after the show has ended or has been canceled. In my opinion, CB Bears actually is a great show, though if I had to rate each one of the segments by quality, it would be CB Bears in first, Shake, Rattle, and Roll second, Posse Impossible third, Hey, It's the King fourth, Undercover Elephant fifth, and Blast Off Buzzard last. Like I said before, each of the segments have varying levels of quality despite being part of the same show. So, of course, it would be natural that any anthology series that has different segments would have a different quality for every segment of said anthology series. Heck, even the Garbage Pail Kids cartoon was not exempt from this, being that the quality of the different segments, whether it's the movie parody segments or even the segments featuring the main Garbage Pail Kids, were also different from each other. Once again, I really do enjoy the CB Bear show for what it is, even in spite of how obscure it is. And yeah, even though a couple of the segments of the show rank lower than that of the other segments, it's still a great show in my opinion. So it's because of this that I will give CB Bear 7 stars. Even though it's not really the best out of a lot of Hanna-Barbera's input, I'll have to give CB Bear some credit. It's good that the show actually had a running theme in each of its segments, what with every single segment of the show being a parody of a different form of pop culture. Some of the segments like CB Bears, Hey, It's the King, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and Posse Impossible really captured the style of what they're parodying. Undercover Elephant was okay with what it was parodying, and Blast Off Buzzard just felt too much like a blatant copy of what it was parodying, in contrast to that of the other 5 segments. Also, surprisingly enough, even in spite of the obscurity of the show, a lot of you may remember HBO Max's Jellystone actually included several characters from CB Bears into that show. Though from what I heard, the only characters that they included were the CB Bears, King and his friends, and Undercover Elephant. It was a real missed opportunity for Jellystone to also include Blast Off Buzzard, Posse Impossible, and Shake, Rattle, and Roll as well, especially since the show ended last year before that could actually happen. Now that's what I call wasted potential. But we shouldn't dwell too much on the past and instead try to focus on the future ahead of us. I really feel that the CB Bears show should be well remembered for the different pop culture parodies, the quirky characters, and the fact that Hanna-Barbera tried to do something different when making an animated anthology series. I'm kind of wondering why we still haven't gotten a DVD or Blu-ray release of this series yet, since a lot of Hanna-Barbera's other shows have also been released on DVD and Blu-ray. Maybe one of these days we will get a DVD or Blu-ray release of the CB Bears show, but only time will tell, as the old saying goes. Well, anyway, that wraps up this episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Like before, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell for more videos from yours truly, whether they're more episodes or something else. Until next time, see you in the future!